So I'm ready to remove the wheel bearings out of the rear wheel. This is the right side, and there's a spacer that fits inside the dust seal, and that spacer on this wheel is just a little bit more than 9 millimeters. So that's the stock right side spacer. And then this is the dust seal, which I'm just going to pop out with a screwdriver. And it just comes right out. And then this is the inner roller bearing. Now inside the hub is the outer race of the roller bearing. And it should be in a steel sleeve, but I want to verify that because the early versions of these wheels used aluminum sleeves. So I'm just going to take a magnet, and it's attracted, and of course if it was aluminum there'd be no attraction. So this is the version of the wheel with the steel sleeve, which is important when it comes to removing the outer race. Now this is the left side hub, and it's put together a little different than the right on the rear wheel. It has a spacer again, but this one is deeper, and I believe this will come out, yeah, this is coming out about 13 millimeters. So it's a different thickness, and that's one reason I'm putting all of the parts for each side of the wheel in a separate bag, so I don't mix things up. And then this dust seal is designed differently than the one I just removed, but I can get it out the same way. Just get a screwdriver up underneath it and just give it a good whack. And the same thing as I had on the other side. This is the roller bearing, and of course they're the same size. And then inside the hub is the outer race for the roller bearing. This is the CycleWorks swing arm bearing puller tool, which also can be used to pull the outer race on the wheel bearings, because the swing arm roller bearing and the rear wheel and front wheel roller bearings are all the same size. There's a set of little Allen head bolts that fit into this cage here on a plate, and then there's a large bolt with a nut, and the flat face of the bolt goes in on the face of the plate, and then the nut points up to the heads of the other Allen bolts. And these all screw in around it and capture that bolt inside. After I got those two in, I tightened all the bolts so they're snug on the nut. And I want to do that because I need a little extra clearance to pull that inner race. So there'll be some threads exposed here outside the plate. Now the way the puller will work is it goes in this way, and there's a puller bolt that threads in, and it has an Allen on this end. So as you tighten this puller bolt up, it pushes the captured bolt up against these 6 Allen bolts, and that spreads them out so the edges slide up under the outer race. So the puller gets captive underneath the race. And then the puller sleeve goes over and sits on the outside of the bearing hub, and then the puller plate, and then the nut. Now, due to the depth of that outer race, I need all the room I can get on the puller bolt, which was why I tightened these up all the way against the face of the nut. So that'll give me the maximum distance on the puller bolt. So I just dropped the assembly, puller assembly, into the hub, and then I use a set of flat jaw pliers to grab the plate and then I use an Allen to tighten up the puller bolt to spread the base of those 6 Allens out. And it's captive up under the outer race now. And I put the sleeve on the hub and then the plate. And if I pull up a little bit and cock the plate, I can capture the puller bolt. There we go. And I get the nut on top. And I'm good to go here. That's got everything assembled properly. I'm going to use a 17mm box and just start tightening. And if I need to, I can immobilize the puller bolt with an Allen, but I don't think I'm going to need to do that. I think it's just going to come right on up and out. So we just keep turning, and eventually that outer race will pop right out of the hub. It's in there about 13mm, so you get to pull it quite a ways. There it comes. And if I back the nut off a little bit, you can see that the race has come right out of the hub. And I'll just disassemble the tool to remove the race off the puller. So this is the outer race to the roller bearing, and a little bit of scoring on the inside, but it's not terrible. Doesn't matter. I'm going to be replacing it anyway. Now I can remove the center tube and assembly here, which is part of the way that the preload is set on the bearings. So there's a wedding band, as it's called, that fits in to this end, and a plastic sleeve, a second plastic sleeve on that end, and no wedding band. So these do go one way, and I'm going to put it back the way I found it, and then I'll label everything when I take that whole assembly apart to clean it. So this is the front wheel, and this is the left side. The procedure to get the bearings out is the same as for the rear. This is that spacer, often called the top hat, on the left side, and it's a 13mm, and I use the same technique to pop the old dust seal out, and it just comes up and out. And then inside is the same size roller bearing as in the rear. Now the right side top hat, that's also a 13mm spacer, and same technique. Just pop out the dust seal and pull out the bearing. Now I use the same CycleWorks puller to pull the left front outer bearing race, and as I look at it, it's scored all along the inside edge here. I think you can see the discoloration, and that's not a good sign. That sounds like the bearing was not well lubricated and or beginning to fail. So it's good I pulled the bearings out of this wheel, because the ones that are in there don't look like they're in good shape. Now that I have the outer race out of the left side of the wheel, I can pull the center tube out, and on the left side there's a wedding band, as it's called, which is now this is the outer race on the right side, and it has the same band of scoring on the inside, so it too was not a happy outer bearing race. So these are all the parts for replacing the wheel bearings. These are the grease or dust seals, and you'll notice this one's a little different color because it's the right rear. And then these are the top hats that fit underneath the seals, And 3 of them are the same size, 13 millimeters long, but the right rear is about 9.2 millimeters. And then these are the 4 sets of bearings, which are the inner race and the outer race. And these actually are the same size as the bearings that'll go in the swing arm. To drive the inner race into the wheel, I'm going to use a part out of the CycleWorks swing arm bearing puller toolkit, and it's just wide enough here to fit on the top of the race, so I'll use it as a drift to drive the race into the wheel hub. So I use this to measure the bearing preload. This is a 1-inch steel pipe that I had cut to 80 millimeters and then made sure that the ends were flat. And I put that over the axle and then used the axle nut with this washer to clamp it on. I wrapped the pipe with string and then pull on that string, spinning the bearing using this scale, a pull scale, and this one measures in grams. So that tells me how much force it takes to spin the bearings, and that's a measure of the preload on the bearing. The bearing preload is set by measuring the force it takes to turn the bearings. So to compute that, you start by measuring the diameter of the sleeve. Mine is 1.1 inches, and then I divide by 2 to get the radius, which is 0.55 inches. The target range of the torque to spin the bearings is between 20 and 30 inch-ounces. That's a very low value. So I have to convert that torque to inch grams since I have a gram pull scale. So I multiply those values by 28.35, and that gives me a low value for 567 inch grams and a high value of 850 inch grams. Now I need to convert the torque to force because that's what I measure with the scale. So I divide the torque by the radius of the sleeve, which was 0.55 inches. That gives me a lower range of force of 1,031 grams and an upper range of 1,546 grams. So I'm going to round those and shoot for a value between 1,030 and 1,550 grams of force. The wheel bearings are called tapered roller bearings, and this is the inner race. And the tapered roller bearing, to last a long time, needs to have a certain preload placed on them, which is an amount of pressure on the rollers. Now there's a pipe in the center of the hub that looks just like this, and it has a sleeve on one end to fit a spacer, and the spacer is called a wetting band. Sort of looks like one, and it fits in on one end. Now when you install the wheel bearings, they're going to be like this inside the hub, so they're going to butt up against the ends of the center pipe. Now if you increase the length of the wetting band, you're going to push one of the bearings a little further away from the other, which means the two will be looser in the outer race, so there'll be less bearing preload. And of course, if you make the wetting band a little shorter, then the two of these are going to be a little closer together. That will increase the pressure on the roller bearing, and the preload will go up. Now, BMW sells a large number of the wetting bands in different thicknesses, and here's a couple of others I got from the CycleWorks kit for adjusting preload. And the other thing in the CycleWorks kit are a series of very thin shims. I think they're 0.05 millimeter. So rather than go off and buy a huge kit full of all these different thickness wedding bands, what I'm going to do is use a wedding band that's pretty close to what we need, and then add a spacer, or sorry, add a shim, and change the distance very little, and get the preload to be exactly what I want it to be. So I'm going to heat the steel sleeve up with my heat gun, and I'm freezing the outer bearing race so it'll be a little easier to drive. Now I've got some 2x4s and soft towels, so when I put the rim down, it's going to rest like that, which keeps the disc off the workbench because I don't want to damage it while I have to pound the bearing race into the bore. So I've been heating the hub, and it's pretty warm, and I just got the frozen outer race. So I'm just going to heat it a little more and then drive the race in. So I have an old race I'm going to use to start it with. Okay, it's flush. Now the bottom of the hole for the race is 22 millimeters and the race is 11. So I need to drive it down far enough so the top of the race will be 11 millimeters below the top of the hub. So I'm going to use the aluminum block to finish up. Now, often you'll hear the hub ring when it bottoms, but I'm going to take a measurement. And I'm right at 11 millimeters, so the outer race is driven as deep as it needs to go. So the wheel bearings on the rear wheel are going to go in at different depths than they do on the front. Now this is the right side with the drive, and the depth to the bottom of the land for the bearing is 20 millimeters. So with an 11 millimeter thick bearing race, I need to drive this side to 9. And I wrote that here to remind me of that, because on the other side, which has got the disc, so that's the left side, the distance down to the bottom of the land is 23.5 millimeters, so that means I need to drive it so I've got 12.5 millimeters from the top of the outer race to the top of the sleeve on this side. I find marking it makes it easy for me not to make a mistake. So this is just a repeat of what I did on the front. Just going to heat it a little bit more. And we'll take our measurement. and I get 12.5. So now I'm ready to do the right side with the drive and just give it a little more heat. Now let's see where we are. A little bit more. There we go. Right at 9. So that one's in too. By the way, one of the other things I do is I put just a little bit of engine oil to make it easy to slide the outer race down the sleeve before I drive it. So when I installed the outer bearing races, I forgot something. I should have installed the center pipe after I got the first race in, and then install the second race, and it would have been inside the hub. The reason why you should do it that way is that the rib here is just a little bit wider than the outer race. So after you get the outer races in, you can't really put the center hub back in the hub. So you can see it just isn't going to go in. Now the solution to that is you can pull the plastic sleeves off the hub, and then you can kind of bend them a little and they'll slide past the outer race. So you can get one in and put the tube in, slide it into the sleeve, fit the other sleeve in, and then push that one on. Now there's some details to keep in mind. The ribs are not centered on the sleeve, so they're closer together toward the center. The purpose of the sleeve is actually just to keep this tube up aligned in the hub, so when you run the axle through, it'll just slide right through. So the only really critical thing is to make sure on this side, when I put the sleeve back on inside the hub, I expose the tube here. And on this side, which is the left, I need to leave enough room for the wedding band to fit, but not so far down on the tube that the wedding band isn't going to be exposed. So I did a little measurement of the depth, and it comes out to be a 5mm deep pocket for the wedding band. So I'll just verify that when I put it together inside the hub. So I'm going to use my vise, and the jaws are set just to come up underneath the ridge here. And then I've got a socket. Mine turns out to be about a 16mm that'll fit right on the pipe, and then I can just tap the pipe right out the bottom. Now, if you look inside, you'll see in the sleeve, there's a little lip right here, which is what catches the wedding band. So when I reinstall it, I'm going to want to make sure that that doesn't get covered by the pipe. And the same technique to get the other one off. Just about got it. There we go. So both of the plastic sleeves are off the center pipe. Now I'm going to install the parts from the left side of the wheel. So this is the right side plastic sleeve, and what I want is for the little rib to be toward the inside of the pipe. So I'm going to just press it right through, and it goes right straight through into the hub. And then I can put the pipe down and center it, and then I'll use a socket to drive the pipe into the plastic sleeve. So I've flipped the wheel over so that the right side plastic sleeve is facing up, and the center pipe is on the other side of the sleeve. Use a 19 socket and just tap the sleeve down the side of the pipe. Now I need to drive that right side sleeve, plastic sleeve, down the pipe a little ways, so I'm going to use a flat blade screwdriver and catch the edge of the rib and just gently tap around the side, and then I'll verify that the pipe is exposed on the right side, and it is. So I've got the right side sleeve installed. So I'm going to put a socket underneath the wheel on the right side, and then I'm going to lay it down so that the right edge of the pipe is sitting on the socket. So that gives me a hard surface that I can use when I install the right side plastic sleeve. And again, this is set up so that this side, meaning, let's be clear, this is where the rib is, so it's going to go inside the pipe, and then that'll leave the little sleeve here for the wedding band. And when I drive it in this time, I want to stop with the edge of the pipe right about equal to this lip. So it's basically the same technique of just popping this in and getting it on top of the pipe, and then using my socket and wrong socket, using my 19mm socket and just tapping this down the sleeve. Now as I tap it, I'm keeping my eye on the sleeve because I want it to only go up to the edge of that lip, which is just about where it is, but I'm going to check it with the wedding band. So the left side plastic sleeve is on, and when I put the wedding band in, I see that the wedding band is proud of the sleeve, which is as it should be. And so I have the center pipe installed in the rear wheel. Now when you install the bearings in the wheel, they're going to be greased. But to do the preload testing, you don't want any grease at all. They need to be absolutely clean. So these are new tapered roller bearings, but regardless of that, I used some carb cleaner and cleaned them so there's nothing in the bearing. And then I'll put a drop or two of 3-in-1 very light oil and make sure that's distributed on all the rollers on both bearings before I do the preload testing. So this is how I'm going to test the preload on the bearings. The bearings will go on the axle in the wheel like that, and then the sleeve goes on the end, and this is the flat washer and the nut. And I'll torque the nut to 25 foot-pounds, and then I'll measure the preload, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. So I've mounted the front wheel in the soft jaws of my vise with some shop rags to protect the rim. And this is the left side of the wheel, which is the side where the center pipe has room in a sleeve for the wedding band. And I'm going to start with the stock wedding band that came out of this wheel. And then I just need to put the rest of the pieces in. So this is the bearing, and I'll run that through from this side, and it comes out like that. And then slide the second bearing on. There we are. Now the next part is to put the sleeve on, and then the little flat washer, and then the nut goes on. And then I'll tighten that up to 25 foot-pounds, which will put the proper load on those bearings. Now I torque up this axle nut to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, I've got that set. Now I've wrapped about 8 feet of string uniformly on the sleeve so that when I pull that, the wheel's going to spin and I'll be able to measure the preload. So I have my scale attached to the string, and the string is uniformly wound on the sleeve. Now I'm going to walk backward at a steady pace, hold the scale level, and see what the average resistance is. So what I got was about 800 grams of pull, and I need more than that, so I'm going to have to adjust the spacer a little bit to give me a little more preload. So after several test runs measuring the resistance, if I use 4 of the 0.05 millimeter shims with the original 7 millimeter thick wedding band, I measure about 800 grams of resistance. But if I take out one of the shims and use 3 of them, the resistance jumps up to closer to 2,000 grams. Now where I want to end up is somewhere between 1030 and 1540 grams of resistance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some 400 grit wet dry paper, and I'm going to sand both faces of the wedding band, and I'm going to do 10 figure eights on each face, and then I'll go back and test with the 4 shims to see where I end up and go from there. So after a couple of laps on the wedding band, I've got the front wheel preload to about 1200 grams, which is right in the sweet spot. So I'm ready to install the bearings and the grease seals or dust caps. Now I lube the bearings with a red grease, which is a high pressure grease and waterproof, and I'll pack the bearings with that, and then I'll put the wedding band back in and the 4 shims, and then I'll drive the grease or dust seals in, and I have a kind of large socket that's just about the exact size of the face of the seal. So that makes for an easy drift to drive them into the hub. So I'm going to start with the left side. So I'm going to put the wedding band in to the sleeve. And then I've packed the bearing full of grease, and I'm going to put the 4 shims on the face of the bearing like that, and they'll kind of stick there with the grease, and then I'll put the bearing in the hub. And I'll just verify that the shims are all lined up. Yeah, there they are. So I put just a little bit more grease around the top of the bearing. And then here's the grease seal and the 13 millimeter top hat. Now the brim of the hat will go on the inside of the seal like that. And then the seal goes into the bore. Now sometimes you can just press the seal in. And this one I think is going to let me do that. And just get it nice and flush with the rim of the hub, and we've got the left side all done. So I followed the same procedure on the right, put the packed bearing in, and then put the top hat with the brim on the inside of the dust seal, and once again I could just press that seal in with my fingers. Like I did with the front wheel, I mounted the rear wheel in my vise using the soft jaws and some shop towels to protect the rim. The left side is facing me, which is the side with the disc brake rotor, and that's the side of the center pipe that has the wedding band in it, so it's easy to get to. So I use the same technique to set the rear wheel bearing preload. However, you'll notice that the rear axle is longer than the front, and so my 80mm sleeve isn't going to fit on this. Consequently, I'm going to do the work by using the front axle instead of the rear in the rear wheel, so my sleeve will fit on it perfectly. So the rear wheel preload required 3 of the 0.05mm shims, and also some sanding on the wedding band. And then the drill's going to be the same, pack the bearings and put everything back in the hub. The difference is in the grease seals. On the left side, it's the same seal and the same top hat as on the front, but on the right side it's not. It's a narrower seal, 5 to 6 millimeters, and the top hat's 9.2 millimeters. So in installing these, you don't want to get confused. You want to make sure that the narrow seal and top hat go in on the right side. So I'm going to start on the right side, which has the thinner grease seal and top hat. And actually I verified that I had marked here the depths of the outer bearing race. So these are the small numbers, and that means I'm on the right side. So basically just drop the bearing in and usually put a little extra around the top there just to make sure everything's nice and lubricated. And then I've got the top hat in with the ridge on the top hat behind the seal, and then I'll see if I'm going to get lucky on this one. And I'm not going to get lucky. It's not actually going to go in by hand, I don't think. So I'm going to try a little bit of persuasion. Yeah, it's going. A little more. There. All right. That's down even with the hub. Now, the left side gets the wedding band that fits in the sleeve. And then it gets the 3 shims, which I'm going to just stick right here in the grease on the bearing and drop that in. And I kind of like to look in and make sure that those shims are centered, and if they aren't, I just use my finger to kind of straighten them out. And they're looking pretty good, so I'll throw a dash more of the grease in on the top of the bearing, like that, and clean up some of my mess. And then this is the left side seal, which is the same as the front with the same as the front top hat. And we'll see if this will just slide in like it did in the front. And I think I'm going to win. Yeah, almost. Maybe a little bit of persuasion will be handy here. Just a little high on that side. There. I think we're all set. Everything's flush. Okay, so we've got the bearings installed in the rear wheel.